G'day, my name is Peter Pulsifer. I'm the lead for Working Group 4 of the Arctic Observing Summit 2020. And in this presentation, I'm going to provide a little bit of background about the subject matter that we're focusing on, which is interoperability, federated search, and other data-related topics. So first, I'm just going to start off with a bit of a review of recent activity for those of you who are not familiar with what's been happening in our field. Since the International Polar Year, which was not quite 15 years ago now, just over a decade, a lot has been happening in terms of coordination and establishing a framework for coordination and cooperation around the topic of Arctic data and polar data in general as part of a broader global data system. So we've now seen a lot of activity, and this activity is moving from discussion of what needs to happen and trying to do the initial connections to more practical and applied things like common architecture, interoperability, shared standards, and that type of thing. There's been a recognition that all perspectives and actors need to be included in this conversation and in these activities. And to that end, we're seeing a lot happening, for example, in the area of Indigenous knowledge and information systems. There's a growing group that's actively working to share Indigenous knowledge and information and data. There's a recognition, though, that there needs to be some progress made on bridging the worldviews, concepts, and the semantics represented in these information systems, and that Indigenous peoples must lead the engagement and work with their knowledge, information. Sovereignty, for example, is important, and we'll touch on that again in a few slides. There's some initiatives happening to try and better understand the system as a whole. It's quite a complex system of organizations and projects and programs, etc. So the Mapping the Polar Data Ecosystem Initiative has been doing some work to try and understand who's doing what where, how they're being connected, and how we can improve our community building and our systems through this type of mapping. There are many different events that have been happening, particularly since International Polar Year. Of course, it started before then, but since International Polar Year, where we first had a workshop in 2006 to focus on polar data, there have been many, many other activities. So I won't go into the details of all of these activities, but you can see that there's a lot been happening. Many of these things have been accelerating these discussions in recent years, and we're now trying to, as I said, turn that from discussion into action. So the most recent I'll talk about a bit later was the Polar Data Forum that was held late last year, and then we're now heading into the Arctic Observing Summit. Through these different activities, we've had a number of different reports, publications, etc. And we currently have an activity going on, or an initiative, to try and understand what we're discussing, what's coming out of these initiatives and these activities. And that is actually currently being worked into a publication. But in the shorter term, we see that we have a number of key themes identified. So community building and coordination is one of the biggest topics of discussion and action. Things like funding, engaging Arctic Indigenous peoples, governance, etc. On the technical side, we're looking at the broader topic of interoperability that includes things like standards, data discovery, federated search, bringing all of the catalogs together so that they can be used in a more useful way to end users, not having to go to multiple different catalogs to find data. And now, more recently, we're also seeing a lot of movement in the area of the emergence of data platforms and e-science. So currently, and by current I mean in the last year or so, we're seeing a lot of activity that the Arctic Data Committee has been involved in. That's a group of the IASC and SAON programs, and it's something that's been in existence since 2014. And the primary activity that the Arctic Data Committee has been focusing on has been on working to bring people together to try and have these conversations. We have not been doing this by any stretch of the imagination alone, though. This has been a huge partnership with many others in the Arctic data community, as well as some others in the Antarctic data community, such as Standing Committee on Antarctic Data Management, the Southern Ocean Observing System, and many of the other organizations and partners that you see here. And we're definitely looking to expand this to increase the number of partners and bring on those who are not yet connected. So this is happening in the context of many different movements as well. So there's a much broader movement in research data called FAIR, which stands for Findable, Accessible, Interoperable, and Reusable. So this is not specific to the polar regions. It's definitely something that is global in scope. More recently, we have the CARE principles, and this is focused on Indigenous knowledge data governance. And so you have the link there and can go to learn more about the CARE principles, but we're seeing many different initiatives and broader movements happening beyond the polar community, the polar community of practice, but that have very important implications for our community. We also see that now there are many different funded projects and programs. So not that long ago, there was probably major gaps. There were major gaps in terms of the capacity, and although that still exists, we definitely see some progress being made in recent years. So we're now in a very good position, particularly in the area of research data management, to move forward and to implement and put into practice some of the things that we've been discussing over the years. The most recent activity, major international activity from that community of practice is the Polar Data Forum, and that's coming out of a series. It started in 2013 with the first Polar Data Forum in Japan. The second was held in Waterloo, Canada in 2015, and most recently in November of 2019, we held the third Polar Data Forum. Sorry, I'm just moving my image around here a little bit, so I'll leave it there, I think. So we have a number of activities that took place at the third Polar Data Forum. So we had a number of different sessions and discussions, meetings, working sessions on community building in the broader context, so thinking about things like data policy, for example, and how we move forward as a community. We also have the group Polder, which is a subgroup that works with Arctic Data Committee, as well as the Standing Committee on Antarctic Data Management and Southern Ocean Observing System. So this group is focusing on federated search, as I described earlier. We've also had some recent related activities at the third Canadian Polar Data Workshop that was held in February of this year, just not very long ago. And we're working together as a community to understand the standards that are required and the approaches to enhancing and realizing federated search on a broader scale. Semantics are always important, thinking about the vocabularies, the terminology used when we're documenting data as well as sharing data. So there is a working group, the ADC IARPIC SCADM Vocabularies and Semantics Working Group. You have the URL on your screen if you're interested, and this group is working to think about what we need to do in terms of semantics and making sure that semantics of the data can be shared and utilized when working with the data. In terms of key outcomes for the third Polar Data Forum, everyone agreed that we need to have continued community building. In practical terms, that meant preparing for the Arctic Observing Summit, engagement in the Say on Roads process, and in this working group we'll have a presentation by Sandy Starkweather, who's going to tell us a bit about that process, which is looking at the broader roadmap for the Arctic Observing System as a whole. Federated search was deemed as very important, and people wanted to continue working on that and ensuring that that moves forward in terms of technical outputs, as well as there are a couple of papers that we're working on to try and articulate what's been happening and what needs to happen there. The semantics, we of course recognize there's a strong connection to the federated search work in terms of things like keywords, etc. And we have a number of other activities that the semantics working group is going to be focusing on in terms of ontology building and that type of thing. And then another topic that came up was the idea of, or the movement, emergence of platforms in model-based science. Or e-science, different ways of describing it, but generally science that's out there on cloud platforms with distributed systems and using large, powerful computing systems. So we want to continue understanding how we situate these platforms, what's happening there, and what kind of implications that will have for our community. So in terms of next steps, and this is where we lead into the working group 4 or sub-theme 4 under the Arctic Observing Summit. We have an opportunity here to have some conversations and to be doing some concrete planning in terms of the next steps. And so I hope that you can engage in this. Specifically, we want to review and confirm priorities based on past and current activities. So to understand if that list that I presented earlier is accurate and fits with the views of the participants at the Arctic Observing Summit. We want to integrate submitted white papers. I'm just going to very quickly go through. There are a number of white papers that were submitted to the process that we'll consider. And I think a key activity will be the third here: discuss and establish strategies and methods to address the work package sub-themes, and essentially working forward on practical planning. And then as an output, we're aiming for a minimum draft statement similar to that was done at the 2018 Arctic Observing Summit. And that was a statement that was then submitted to the second Arctic Science Ministerial, and the plan would be also to submit this statement to the third Arctic Science Ministerial that is expected to happen late this year. I won't go into the details of the white papers. You can go to the Arctic Observing Summit website to look at those. But we have a number of different papers, one that's looking at designing end-to-end systems. So how do we connect autonomous vehicles and the actual sensors into the system? What's happening there? What kind of standards might we want to use, methodologies, and how do we ensure that those data that are being produced in many different ways make it to the appropriate end users? How do we take very domain-specific data, such as that in the Arctic Biodiversity Data Service, and make them available and broadly usable? How do we connect these domain-based systems into the broader system? There's a paper focusing on the needs of the Copernicus program, and also what's already out there in terms of the data that they require for in situ data to go with the remote sensing data that is provided through that program. And so that's a really interesting paper that helps to broaden our knowledge of what's needed and also what's out there already and not. There's a paper on integrating artificial intelligence and modeling. That was actually withdrawn as the lead author was not able to make it to the Arctic Observing Summit, but it is still on the website if you want to review it. And then last but not least, a paper that Bill Manley and others submitted that's going to be telling us a bit about a new initiative to try and document the observing system. So earlier I showed you a slide where we're looking at documenting the data system. This would be an effort to go a much larger step further to understanding the assets that are actually in place, and how those operate, who's operating them, the data that's being produced, and so on. So that would really help us to do a really broad and systematic review of the entire observing system rather than strictly the data systems. So just to reiterate and to summarize, so for working group 4, we have some broad objectives, which are review and confirm the priorities, based on the past and current activities, integrate the submitted white papers, discuss and establish the strategies and methods to address the work package sub-themes, such as federated search, for example, interoperability, and so on, and then to work together to draft a statement. And the last two sessions on the program, sessions 5 and session 6, will be focused on writing. So I hope that you can join us in working group 4, and you will see, you can find at the URL that I provided the details, the connection details, and so on for each day. We will be recording each session and providing those, making those available very soon after the session. So if you're not able to make them all, not to worry, you can step in, and we'll be addressing each of the topics to the extent that the participants need to during each session. So I look forward to engaging with you over the coming days, and have a good day.